The grand concourse of Viridian Station shimmered under the soft glow of bioluminescent panels, its curved walls built to welcome over 24 spacefaring species. The air hummed with the quiet buzz of translators, the rustle of alien fabrics, and the occasional low growl or chitter from delegates adjusting to the shared environment. At the center of it all stood Daniel Carter, Earth's ambassador, a man in his late 40s with calm eyes and a quiet voice that carried more weight than most realized. He wore a simple dark suit, no medals, no flashy tech, just a small Earth pin on his lapel. Around him, representatives from the Krell hegemony, the Vexari Collective, the Lamari Concord, and a dozen other civilizations sat in a wide semicircle. Some were massive, like the Krell envoy whose obsidian carapace scraped the floor. Others were small and many-limbed, like the Vexari, whose segmented bodies twitched with constant motion. The Lomari sat in custom humidity pods, their smooth blue skin glistening under the station lights. Tensions had been rising for months. Earth, once seen as a young and unimportant world, had surprised everyone. In just a few decades, humanity had gone from barely reaching Mars to mastering quantum shielding, zero-point energy, and faster-than-light travel. Older powers didn't like being overtaken by newcomers. Whispers had spread through the Galactic Council that Earth was too bold, too fast, too unpredictable. Some even claimed humanity was hiding weapons, plotting to dominate the Helios Belt, a rich zone of rare minerals claimed by 5 different species. Today's summit was supposed to settle that dispute peacefully, but everyone knew peace was fragile. The Krell had moved 3 battlecruisers near human outposts last week. The Vexari had cut off trade with Earth colonies. Even the usually neutral Lomari had grown distant. Daniel knew all this. He'd read the reports, studied the patterns, listened to every coded message his team had intercepted. He also knew that fear made species act rashly. So he stepped onto the dais, took a slow breath, and began to speak. His voice was steady, clear, and calm. He talked about shared resources, about the cost of war, about how no one truly won when worlds burned. He spoke of Earth's desire to cooperate, to learn, to build something lasting. Most delegates listened politely, though some shifted impatiently. Then, just as he neared the end of his speech, Daniel added something that made the entire room freeze. "Of course," he said, almost casually, "if any of you were considering less diplomatic approaches, I should mention that Earth maintains detailed contingency plans for every species currently in this room." The words hung in the air like a stone dropped into still water. The hum of the station seemed to vanish. The Krell envoy tilted his massive head, 4 crimson eyes narrowing. The Vexari stopped their constant clicking. Even the mist inside the Lomari pod stilled. No one moved. No one spoke. Contingency plans. The phrase meant different things to different species, but all understood the core idea. Earth had thought about how to deal with them, not just in friendship, but in conflict. And not just in vague terms. Detailed plans for each of them, individually. Lisa Tran, Daniel's aide, stood quietly behind him, her hands folded. She had helped compile those files. She knew how much work had gone into them, not through spying, but through years of careful observation, open-source data, cultural studies, and scientific analysis. Earth hadn't hacked anyone's systems. They'd simply paid attention. But the delegates didn't know that yet. All they heard was that a young species, barely out of its planetary cradle, claimed to have strategies ready for them: the ancient Krell warriors, the hive-minded Vexari swarm, the biosensitive Lomari. It sounded like arrogance, or madness. The Krell envoy finally broke the silence. Contingency protocols. "Against us?" His voice was deep, resonant, like stone grinding against stone. Daniel didn't flinch. He met the Krell's gaze evenly.
"Not as threats.
As safeguards. We've studied your biology, your technology, your history, your values. If conflict ever arose, and we pray it never does, we'd prefer to resolve it with minimal loss." On all sides, a low murmur spread through the room. Some delegates exchanged glances. Others stiffened. The Vexari envoy let out a sharp, chittering laugh. "You think your fragile world, your soft bodies, your primitive ships could stand against the Vexari swarm? You left your home star less than a century ago. We have ruled the outer spirals for 10,000 cycles." Daniel didn't smile. He didn't raise his voice. "We don't need to defeat you outright," he said simply. "We just need to make victory cost more than it's worth." That statement landed harder than any boast. Every species in the room understood economics, loss, and sacrifice. War wasn't just about who won. It was about what you lost along the way. If Earth could make attacking them too expensive, too messy, too uncertain, then even the most aggressive powers might think twice. Behind Daniel, Lisa tapped a command into her wrist console. A soft chime echoed through the chamber. Every delegate's personal interface, whether embedded in their skin, worn as a band, or floating as a drone, received a single encrypted file. The label was plain: sample protocol for review only. No password. No tricks, just an open invitation. The Lomari ambassador, her gills fluttering nervously, opened the file first. Her large dark eyes scanned the contents. It wasn't a weapon design. It wasn't a fleet deployment map. It was a detailed analysis of Lomari biology, specifically their reliance on saline-rich mist for neural function, and a proposed non-lethal aerosol compound that could temporarily disrupt their coordination without causing permanent harm. More importantly, it included notes on Lomari cultural taboos. Never harm a breeding pool, never block access to tidal zones, always allow retreat with dignity. The plan wasn't about killing. It was about stopping a fight before it escalated. The Krell envoy accessed his file next. His massive fingers moved slowly over the holographic display. The document outlined weaknesses in Krell's shield harmonics, but not to exploit them cruelly. Instead, it suggested a ritual challenge, a single combat duel between champions, a tradition the Krell honored above all else. Earth had found a way to turn war into ceremony. The Vexari, skeptical at first, ran their hive mind analysis on the sample. Within seconds, their collective consciousness recoiled. The file predicted their resource allocation patterns, their decision thresholds, even their likely response to economic sanctions. It wasn't perfect, but it was frighteningly close. And again, the proposed response wasn't violence. It was a trade embargo on specific rare earth elements the Vexari needed for their bioships, paired with an offer to share alternative synthesis methods, if peace held. The room remained silent, but the mood had shifted. Suspicion hadn't vanished, but it was now mixed with something else: respect, maybe even fear. Not fear of Earth's weapons, but fear of Earth's understanding. Daniel stepped back from the dais, his message delivered. He didn't gloat. He didn't press. He simply stood there, a quiet man in a simple suit, representing a species that had chosen knowledge over bluster, preparation over panic. As the delegates began to whisper among themselves, one truth settled over Viridian Station like a heavy blanket. Humanity wasn't just surviving out here. They were thinking ahead, and that more than any weapon made them dangerous. In the corridors outside the Grand Concourse, the air felt heavier than before. Delegates moved slowly, their usual confident strides replaced by cautious steps. The revelation from Earth's ambassador had shaken something deep in the room, a belief that humanity was still naive, still playing catch-up. Now that belief lay in pieces. The Krell envoy Gorvax walked with his armored limbs clicking against the polished floor. His four eyes scanned the hallway, not for threats, but for signs of shifting alliances. He had expected Earth to beg for a seat at the table. Instead, they had calmly placed a file on it that showed they understood Krell honor better than some of his own rivals did. That stung, but it also stirred a grudging respect. Near the hydroponic gardens, two Vexari drones hovered close together, their segmented bodies vibrating as they exchanged rapid pulses of data. Their hive mind was disturbed. Earth's sample protocol hadn't just listed weaknesses, it had predicted behavioral responses with eerie accuracy. Worse, it offered alternatives that preserved Vexari interests while avoiding bloodshed. That was not the act of a reckless upstart. That was the work of a patient, calculating mind. And patience was something the Vexari valued above all else. Lisa Tran walked quietly behind Daniel Carter as they made their way back to Earth's temporary embassy suite. She carried no visible weapons, no flashy tech, just a small tablet and a calm expression. But inside her thoughts raced. She had helped compile those files over months of late nights and endless data reviews. They weren't war plans. They were escape routes, peace paths, off-ramps from conflict. Yet the way the other species had reacted told her something important. In a galaxy built on power, showing you could stop a war was just as powerful as showing you could start one. Back in the main chamber, The Lamari ambassador, Nyella, floated gently in her portable mist pod, her gills pulsing slowly. She replayed Earth's file in her mind. It mentioned her people's sacred tidal cycles, their aversion to sonic disruption, their need for clean brine during breeding season. No outsider had ever acknowledged those details in a security document before. Most species treated the Lomari as fragile curiosities, useful for diplomacy, useless in war. But Earth had treated them as whole beings, with strengths and limits worth respecting. That alone made her reconsider every assumption she'd held about humanity. Meanwhile, on a secure channel, news of the summit spread faster than light. On Earth, in government offices and military hubs, leaders watched the feeds with bated breath. Some praised Daniel for his boldness. Others feared he had painted a target on every human colony. "He just told every hostile species we've studied them like lab rats," muttered one general in Geneva. "They'll see it as a threat." But Admiral Cole, an old friend of Daniel's, shook his head. "No. He showed them we don't want to fight, but we're ready if we must. That's not a threat. That's honesty. And honesty in a galaxy full of double talk and hidden agendas was rare enough to be powerful." By the next cycle, something unexpected happened. The Krell fleet stationed near the Helios belt powered down its weapons arrays. Not fully, but enough to be noticed. The Vexari halted their blockade of human trade lanes, citing diplomatic review. Even the Lomari sent a quiet message to Earth's embassy. "We would like to discuss mutual environmental safeguards." Daniel received the messages in his quarters, sipping plain black coffee from a ceramic mug. Lisa stood by the window watching stars drift past the station's viewport. "They're testing us," she said, "seeing if we'll back down now that we've spoken." "Or if we meant what we said," Daniel replied. He didn't sound worried. He sounded tired but certain, because the truth was Earth didn't have secret superweapons. They didn't have galaxy-crushing fleets or reality-bending tech. What they had was something older, quieter, and far more human. The ability to listen, to learn, and to plan, not for victory but for survival with dignity. That night, a private request came through from the Krell envoy. Gorvax wanted to meet Daniel alone, without aides, without recorders. Just two beings speaking plainly. Daniel agreed. In a neutral lounge lit by soft amber light, the two sat across from each other. Gorvax's voice was low, stripped of its usual booming tone. "Your file on us. It included the trial of shattered stone. A ritual not used in 300 cycles. How did you know?" Daniel leaned forward slightly. "We read your old texts, the ones your scholars published during the peace accords of Lyra. Most species skip the cultural archives. We don't." Gorvax was silent for a long moment. Then he made a sound that in Krell terms was almost a chuckle. "You did not seek to shame us with our past. You sought to honor it." "We seek to understand," Daniel said. "Because misunderstanding starts wars. Understanding might stop them." Elsewhere, the Vixari sent a different kind of message. Not words, but data. A full schematic of their bioship nutrient cycle, voluntarily shared. It was a test, yes, but also an offer. If Earth truly understood them, perhaps they could understand Earth in return. Lisa reviewed the data with quiet awe. It was more detailed than anything humanity had ever accessed. And it came with no strings attached. Just a single line at the end. "Show us your logic." Back on Earth, public broadcasts began to shift. News anchors spoke not of fear, but of pride. School children drew pictures of Ambassador Carter standing calmly before alien giants. Scientists debated the ethics of contingency planning. But even critics admitted, Earth had chosen restraint over rage, foresight over force. And in the quiet corners of Viridian Station, something new began to grow. Not trust, not yet, but the possibility of it. Species that had eyed each other with suspicion for generations now watched Earth and wondered, if humans could plan for peace even in the shadow of war, what else might they be capable of? Daniel didn't know the answer, but as he looked out at the stars that night, he allowed himself a small, tired smile. They had taken a risk. They had spoken plainly in a place where silence was safer. And so far the galaxy hadn't struck back. Instead, it had leaned in to listen. And sometimes that was enough. Days passed on Viridian Station, and the air remained thick with quiet tension. But it was a different kind of tension now. Not the sharp edge of impending conflict, but the slow hum of something uncertain unfolding. Earth's embassy suite had become a place of unexpected traffic. Delegates who once avoided human spaces now lingered near its doors, some sending polite requests for meetings, others simply watching from a distance. Daniel Carter moved through it all with the same calm he'd shown on the dais, though his eyes held the weight of knowing how fragile this moment was. One misstep, one misunderstood word, and the fragile thread of curiosity could snap back into suspicion. Lisa Tran worked tirelessly behind the scenes, coordinating responses, verifying data, and ensuring every interaction stayed true to Earth's message. We are not your enemy, but we will not be your victim. She had little time to sleep, but she didn't mind. This was history being written in real time, and she was part of it. The real shift came when the Krell requested a joint review of the Helios Belt mining zones. Not as rivals, but as partners. Gorvax, the Krell envoy, stood in Earth's briefing room, his massive frame oddly gentle as he pointed to a star map. Your analysis of mineral distribution matches our own, he said, his voice low. But you included buffer zones around Lamari spawning vents. We had not considered that. Daniel nodded. Because war isn't just about who controls the ore. It's about who survives after the dust settles. Gorvax made that quiet Krell sound again, almost a sigh. You think like a builder, not a conqueror. That phrase spread through the station faster than any official communique. Builder, not conqueror. It stuck to Earth like a second skin. Meanwhile, the Vexari did something even more surprising. They called for an emergency session, not to accuse, but to propose a new rule for the Galactic Council. All species must declare non-lethal conflict resolution options before any military action is authorized. It was a direct echo of Earth's approach. When asked why, their lead envoy simply pulsed a data stream that translated to, efficiency favors preservation over destruction. Earth proved this. Even the Lomari began to speak more openly. Nyala met with Lisa in a quiet garden chamber filled with mist and soft blue light. Your file showed you knew our weakness, she said, her voice like water over stones. But you chose not to exploit it. Why? Lisa looked at her not as a diplomat but as one person to another. Because knowing someone's weakness doesn't give you the right to use it. It gives you the responsibility not to. Nayla's gills fluttered in what might have been a smile. Then perhaps humanity is not as young as we thought. Back on Earth, the mood had shifted from anxiety to cautious hope. Military command centers still monitored fleet movements, but the alerts had changed from red to yellow. Trade ships that had been rerouted now returned to their original paths. In schools, teachers spoke of diplomacy as strength. In homes, families watched the news not with fear but with pride. Yet not everyone was pleased. A small faction within the Vexari hive, older, more aggressive nodes, began whispering that Earth's peace plans were a trap. They argued that showing such detailed knowledge meant humanity had been watching them for years, possibly infiltrating their networks. Though no evidence supported this, the doubt spread like mold in dark corners. Daniel knew about it. He also knew he couldn't fight every rumor, so he did the only thing he could. He invited the doubters to see for themselves. He opened Earth's public archives on Viridian Station's shared network. Decades of scientific papers, cultural studies, open diplomatic logs. Nothing classified, nothing hidden. Just proof that Earth's knowledge came not from spies, but from listening, reading, and watching openly, like any student of the galaxy should. The move stunned even his allies. You're giving them everything, Lisa had said, eyes wide. What if they use it against us? They already have our sample files, Daniel replied. If they wanted to attack, they would have. But they haven't. That means they're thinking. And thinking is the first step away from war. His gamble paid off. Within hours, the Vexari's main hive mind issued a public statement. Earth's data aligns with observable history. No covert surveillance detected. Conclusion, transparency confirmed. The aggressive faction fell silent. Not because they were convinced, but because the hive had spoken, and unity mattered more than pride. On the station's observation deck, Daniel stood alone one evening, watching a cargo freighter drift past Jupiter's distant glow. He thought about his home. Green hills, rainy mornings, the smell of coffee, and a quiet kitchen. He missed it deeply, but he also knew why he was here. Humanity had spent centuries fighting itself. Now, out among the stars, they had a chance to be different. Not perfect, just better. Lisa joined him, holding 2 mugs of tea. The Krell just agreed to joint patrols in the belt, she said softly. No weapons drawn, just presence. Good, Daniel said. Presence is the first language of peace. They stood in silence for a while, the stars stretching endlessly before them. Then a chime sounded from Lisa's wristband. Another message, this time from the Silvani, a reclusive avian species who had never attended a summit before. Their note was short. We wish to know if Earth has a contingency plan for us. Daniel smiled faintly. Tell them yes, and that we'd be honored to share it, if they're willing to share theirs in return. That simple exchange marked a turning point. The Silvani had always stayed apart, believing no one could understand their skybound ways. But Earth hadn't assumed. They had prepared, and that preparation, offered without demand, opened a door no treaty ever could. By the end of the week, 5 more species had reached out. Not to challenge, not to threaten, but to ask, what do you know about us? And more importantly, what do you suggest we do if things go wrong? Earth's answer was always the same. Let's plan a way out before we ever walk in. No grand speeches, no ultimatums, just quiet, careful thought given freely. And in a galaxy used to power measured in firepower, that quiet thought began to echo louder than any explosion. Daniel sipped his tea, the warmth spreading through his hands. He didn't know what came next, but for the first time in a long time he believed it might be peace. Not perfect peace, not forever peace, but a start. And sometimes a start was everything. A week after the summit, a small chamber deep inside Viridian Station was cleared for a private meeting. Only 5 species were invited. The Krell, the Vexari, the Lomari, the Silvani, and Earth. No recorders. No observers. Just 10 beings, 2 from each delegation, sitting around a plain circular table under soft white light. Daniel Carter sat with Lisa Tran beside him. Across from them, Gorvax of the Krell folded his armored limbs carefully to fit. The Vexari envoy pulsed gently in a custom suspension field. Nayela of the Lomari rested in a compact mist pod, while the Silvani representative perched lightly on a padded stand, her feathered wings tucked close. The air was still. No one spoke at first. Then Daniel leaned forward slightly and said, "You asked to know the truth behind the files. So here it is." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't gesture. He simply told them what Earth had really done. Our so-called contingency plans aren't weapons. They're exit strategies. They're ways to stop a fight before it starts, or end it before it destroys everything. He explained how Earth's team had spent years studying open records, historical texts, scientific journals, public broadcasts, even art and music. They learned how the Krell valued honor above victory, how the Vexari calculated cost versus gain down to the last resource unit, how the Lomari would rather retreat than risk their young, and how the Silvani saw the sky not as empty space but as sacred ground that must never be stained with violence. "We didn't build bombs for you," Daniel said. "We built bridges. Hidden in plain sight." Lisa added, "For the Krell, we suggested ritual combat because we knew you'd accept a fair duel over a wasteful war. For the Vexari, we modeled trade alternatives because your hive prioritizes long-term survival over short-term conquest. For the Lomari, we designed non-lethal deterrents that protect your biology, not harm it. And for the Silvani, we proposed orbital no-fly zones during nesting cycles because your young must learn to fly without fear." The Silvani envoy tilted her head, her large eyes gleaming. "You knew of our nesting cycles? That is not in any public archive." "No," Lisa admitted, "but your poetry is. And your songs speak of the first wind and the silent cradle." We listened. A long silence followed. Then Gorvax made that low, rumbling sound again. Not a laugh, but something deeper. "You studied not just how to beat us, but how to spare us. That is honorable." The Vexari envoy flickered brighter. "Our hive analyzed your logic. It is sound, efficient, it preserves value. We had assumed you were bluffing. But your data matches reality. That is rare." Nayla's voice was soft. "You saw us as whole beings, not just obstacles or allies. That is a kindness few offer." Daniel looked at each of them in turn. "We don't want to fight anyone. But we also won't pretend conflict is impossible." So we asked ourselves, if the worst happens, how do we make sure everyone walks away with their dignity, their people, and their future intact? That question seemed to settle into the room like dust after a storm. The Krell envoy straightened. "Then let us speak plainly. The hegemony has considered military action against your mining outposts, not out of hatred, but because we believed you would not understand our need for the Belt's alloys. Now we see you do. Perhaps we can share, not seize. The Vexari pulsed in agreement. Our swarm fleets can reroute. If Earth provides the alternative synthesis method mentioned in your file, we will test it. If it works, trade resumes. No conditions. Nayla added. The Lamari will support joint environmental monitoring in the belt. Our sensors can detect brine contamination before it spreads. We offer this freely. The Silvani spread her wings slightly, a sign of trust. We will open our sky charts to you. Not as a gift, but as a pact. You respect our silence. We respect your presence. Daniel nodded slowly. Then let this be the start of something new. Not just between us, but for everyone. Lisa reached into her satchel and placed a small data crystal on the table. This contains full versions of all 5 protocols. Not samples, complete, with notes, sources, and suggested revisions. You can change them, improve them, share them with others if you wish. Gorvax picked up the crystal carefully. You trust us with this? We trust you to use it wisely, Daniel said, because we've seen you do that already. The meeting ended not with signatures or fanfare, but with quiet nods and shared looks that carried more meaning than any treaty. As they left the chamber, something had shifted, not just in policy but in perspective. Earth was no longer the unknown newcomer. They were the ones who listened, who planned not for domination but for coexistence. Back in their suite, Lisa finally let out a breath she felt she'd been holding for weeks. Do you think it will last? She asked. Daniel poured 2 glasses of water. Nothing lasts forever. But if we give others a reason to choose peace even just once, that's a win. Over the next few days, news of the private meeting spread quietly. Not through official channels, but through the unspoken network of diplomats who knew when something real had happened. Other species began asking questions. Not hostile ones. Curious ones. Does Earth have a plan for us too? Can we see it? Will you help us make one for others? Daniel's answer was always the same. Yes, if you're willing to be honest about your own needs and limits. Slowly, carefully, a new idea began to take root on Viridian Station. Not just that Earth was strong, but that strength could look like understanding, like preparation without pride, like offering your enemy a way out before the first shot is fired. And in a galaxy where power had always meant the ability to destroy, this new kind of power, the power to prevent destruction, began to shine brighter than any weapon ever could. The summit ended not with fanfare, but with quiet handshakes, shared data crystals, and promises spoken in low voices. Delegates who had arrived eyeing each other with suspicion now exchanged nods of respect. Earth's embassy, once a modest corner of Viridian Station, became a place others sought out. Not for secrets, but for conversation. Daniel Carter stood by the viewport one last time before departure, watching the slow dance of ships against the starfield. He wore the same simple suit, the Earth pin still on his lapel. Behind him, Lisa Tran packed their final items, her movements calm, her mind already turning to the work ahead. They had done what they came to do. Not by shouting, not by threatening, but by showing that humanity's greatest weapon was not fire, but foresight. In the weeks that followed, the galaxy changed in small but real ways. The Krell and Earth began joint patrols in the Helios belt, their ships flying in formation, not opposition. The Vexari tested Earth's alternative synthesis method for rare bioalloys and found it worked better than expected. Trade lanes reopened, not with fanfare but with steady cargo runs and shared maintenance protocols. The Lamari deployed their environmental sensors across the belt, and Earth engineers helped calibrate them. The Silvani, once silent observers, now shared sky charts that helped all species avoid sacred zones during flight. But the biggest change came from an idea born in that private meeting. Earth proposed something new, the Galactic Contingency Exchange. Not a weapon archive, not a war council. A voluntary forum where any species could submit their own conflict resolution frameworks, cultural, biological, technological, and in return receive others. No force, no spying. Just mutual understanding offered freely. To everyone's surprise, the Krell were the first to join. They submitted their full honor duel protocols, including ancient rules long forgotten. The Vexari added their resource priority algorithms. The Lamari shared their environmental red lines. Even smaller species, ones who had never spoken at a summit, sent in their files, simple notes on what would make them flee, what would make them fight, and what might bring them back to the table. Earth didn't lead the exchange. They simply helped build it, then stepped back and let others shape it. That humility spoke louder than any speech. Back on Earth, life returned to normal, but not quite. Children in classrooms now learned about Krell honor codes and Vixari hive logic alongside math and history. Engineers designed ships with modular systems that could adapt to alien docking standards. Diplomats trained not just in negotiation, but in cultural empathy. Humanity hadn't become perfect. Mistakes still happened. Misunderstandings still flared. But now, when tensions rose, someone would say, "Check the exchange file," and cooler heads would prevail. Daniel returned to Earth quietly. No parade, no medals. Just a hug from his sister at the spaceport, and a long walk through a rainy city he'd almost forgotten. He gave one interview, just one, to a small news outlet. When asked how Earth pulled it off, he said only this: "We didn't plan to win a war. We planned to make sure no one wanted to start one." Those words spread, not as a slogan, but as a quiet truth. Other species began saying it too in their own tongues. On Viridian Station, the Grand Concourse no longer felt like a battleground of egos. It felt like a workshop where beings from different worlds came not to conquer, but to compare notes on how to survive together. Lisa stayed on the station for a while longer, helping set up the exchange's first physical hub. She worked with Krell archivists, Vixari data weavers, and Lomari biologists. They argued sometimes. They disagreed often. But they always came back to the table because they knew the alternative was worse, and because Earth had shown them there was another way. Years later, historians would call it the Carter Doctrine, not because it was written in law, but because it lived in practice. The idea that true strength lies not in how hard you can hit, but in how well you understand the one you might have to face. No species ever used Earth's original contingency files in anger. Not once. But they were read, studied, improved upon, shared. And in that sharing, something fragile but real began to grow. Trust. Not blind trust, not foolish trust, but the kind earned through honesty, preparation, and respect. Daniel never sought fame. He retired to a small house near the coast where he grew tomatoes and watched the sunset. Sometimes students would visit, asking how one man changed the galaxy. He'd just smile and say, "I didn't, we all did." Earth just reminded everyone that peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's the presence of a better option. And in the end, that was enough. The stars kept turning. Ships kept flying. And somewhere in a quiet corner of the galaxy, a young diplomat from a new species opened their first exchange file, read Earth's notes on de-escalation, and chose to talk instead of fight. That was the real victory, not in battles won, but in battles never fought. And humanity, once seen as too young, too loud, too eager, had shown the oldest powers that sometimes the wisest move is not to strike, but to understand.